He was standing on my own front porch, the one we built together, the summer he turned 14, back when his hands were still smaller than mine. 18 years old now, my boy, and he wouldn't look at me. "You're not my father," he said. "You never were." And then he said the part that broke something in my chest I still haven't gotten fixed. "How much did they pay you to keep me?" There was a black car idling in my driveway, a man behind the wheel, smiling. It took me 4 months to find out what that man had really come back for. And the answer was sitting in a bank vault 40 minutes from my house, behind a $28 charge I'd been paying every March for 11 years, and never once questioned. But let me back up. Because you need to understand how a man ends up standing on his own porch, being told he was never anybody's father. My name's Ray Dolan. I'm 51 years old, and I fix furnaces for a living, heating and cooling. Wexford, Ohio, a town of 9,000 people, 1 high school, 2 stoplights, and a grain elevator you can see from the interstate. I've got a shop out on Route 9 with a hand-painted sign, and I'm the kind of man who spent most of his adult life on his back in a crawl space with a flashlight in his teeth. That's me. That's the whole resume. I want you to hold on to that because it matters later. I met Julia at 1 o'clock in the morning on a February night in 2008, coldest week of that whole winter. 15 below with the wind. The boiler had quit at a 4-unit apartment building on Vine Street, and the landlord wouldn't answer his phone, so a 22-year-old girl in Unit 2 called the emergency line herself and asked how much it would cost. I told her I'd look at it first and we'd talk money after. I'll never forget walking into that building. You could see her breath in the hallway, and from behind her door I could hear a baby crying. That thin, exhausted crying a baby does when he's been at it a long time and nobody's coming. She opened the door wearing a coat over a coat. 10-month-old boy on her hip wrapped in a bath towel because she'd run out of clean blankets. That was Nate. Took me 4 hours to get that boiler running, cracked igniter and a gas valve so old it didn't make the part anymore. I ended up rigging it with something off my own truck. When the heat finally kicked on, the radiator started ticking, and that baby fell asleep in about 90 seconds, and Julia sat down on the floor of that kitchen and cried like she'd been holding it for a year. She asked what she owed me. I said the landlord could pay it. He never did, by the way. I ate that one. Best $240 I ever lost. Look, I'm not going to pretend I was some hero. I went back the next week to check the pilot, and I didn't need to. I went back the week after that with a car seat I'd found at a church sale, and I definitely didn't need to. By April, I was bringing groceries. By that fall, I was the guy who knew which way to jiggle the handle on her toilet. I asked her once about Nate's father. One time. She got real quiet, and she said, "He's not in the picture, and he's never going to be." And something in her face closed like a door, and I decided right there that I was never going to be the man who made her open it. I've thought about that decision about 9 million times since. We got married when Nate was 2. Little ceremony at the courthouse in Dunmore, her sister, and my buddy Gus as witnesses, lunch at a diner after. She wore a blue dress, I still have the picture, and then I just raised him. That's the whole story of the next 16 years, honestly. I raised him. I was the one who slept on his floor when he had croup. I was the one who figured out he needed glasses because he was sitting 11 inches from the television. Taught him to ride a bike on the road behind the Methodist church. Taught him to bait a hook, taught him to shake a man's hand, taught him to drive a stick in the empty lot behind my shop, and I've still got the transmission bill to prove it. He called me Dad the first time when he was 4. T-ball game. I was coaching first base, and he hit a dribbler up the line, and he came flying past me screaming, "D-A-D, you see it? Do you see it?" And I had to turn around and pretend I had something in my eye in front of 11 other fathers. Nobody told him to say it. He just did. When he was 12, I let him repaint the sign at the shop. It had said Dolan Heating and Cooling since 1998. He asked if he could add something. Took him a whole Saturday and about 4 coats to get it right. Dolan and Son. That sign's still out there on Route 9. I'll get back to that sign. Now, here's the part I have to tell you, even though it's the part I'm ashamed of. I never legally adopted him. I tried. First time was the spring he turned 7, when he needed a form signed for Little League, and he asked me. Quiet, like he was scared of the answer, why his last name was different from mine on the roster. Broke my heart in half. That week, I drove to Dale Whitcomb's office above the hardware store, and I got the paperwork, and I brought it home, and I set it on the kitchen table like it was a birthday cake. And Julia looked at it for a long time, and she said, "Not yet." She said the father's name wasn't on the birth certificate, so we'd have to publish notice and go through a search and get a judge involved, and what if it woke something up? What if he came back? She said it in this voice I'd never heard her use, small, like a kid. So I said okay, Because I loved her, and because she was scared, and because I figured I had time. I brought those forms home 3 more times over the years. Every single time, next year, Ray. Let's do it next year. 9 years, I let her tell me that. 9 years. And then in 2021, she found a lump that turned out to be nothing where they said it was, and everything where they didn't look. Ovarian. Stage 3 by the time anybody caught it. I sold my second truck. I took a second mortgage on the house. Gus ran the shop for 11 months for basically nothing, so I could sit in oncology waiting rooms in Toledo reading the same fishing magazine 40 times. I did everything a man can do with money he doesn't have. She died in October of 2022. She was 38 years old. Nate was 15. And after that, it was just the two of us in that house. You know what nobody tells you about grief? It makes you closer or it makes you strangers. And there's no third option. Us. We got closer. We ate a lot of frozen pizza. We watched a lot of bad TV. He'd come out to the shop after school and hand me wrenches, and we wouldn't say a word for 2 hours, and it was the best part of my day. 3 years, just him and me. I got him to graduation, honor roll. Accepted to Ohio State for the fall, first Dolan to ever get past a 2-year degree, and yeah, I know, technically he wasn't a Dolan. He put it on the application anyway. Nathan Dolan. Told me the other name felt like a stranger's. Graduation night. June. Gym so hot the band kids were wilting. I hollered so loud when they called his name that a woman 2 rows up turned around and gave me a look. And afterward, out in the parking lot, I was loading his gown into my truck when I saw a man standing about 20 feet away. Gray suit. The kind of suit that costs more than my truck. Silver watch. Just standing there in a high school parking lot in Wexford, Ohio, like he'd been dropped out of a helicopter. He was looking at Nate across the lot laughing with his friends, and then he looked at me. He did a nice job at him, he said. I'd never seen this man before in my life. Not once. But here's the thing, and I felt it in my stomach before my brain caught up. Nate had my walk, he had my terrible jokes, he had the way I stand with my arms crossed when I'm listening. But he never had my eyes. Not ever. Those green eyes he got from somewhere, and Julia's were brown, and I stopped wondering about it a long, long time ago. This man in the gray suit was standing in a parking lot smiling at me, with my son's eyes. He said it like a compliment. That's the part that still gets me. You did a nice job with him. I stood there with a polyester graduation gown balled up in my fist, and I said, Do I know you? He walked over. Slow, comfortable, hand out, and I remember thinking his hand was the softest hand I'd ever shaken in my life. 50-something years old, and not one callus on him. Miles Ashford, he said. I waited. And when I didn't react, he tipped his head a little, almost amused, like he'd expected more. Julia never mentioned me. Now, I want you to understand something. Standing in that parking lot, with the band still packing up and somebody's grandmother honking behind us, I did the math in about a second and a half, and I felt every bit of my 51 years land on me at once. No, I said. She didn't. He looked back over at Nate. My boy had his cap off, tie loose, arm around some girl's shoulders, laughing at nothing the way you only laugh at 18. And Miles Ashford said, He's got my mother's eyes. Then he handed me a card. Cream-colored, heavy stock, raised lettering. Ashford Development Group, Columbus. I'm not here to cause you any trouble, Mr. Dolan, he said. I just want to talk to him, when he's ready. And this is what I keep coming back to, he didn't go over there. He didn't walk across that lot and introduce himself to his son on the biggest night of the kid's life. He got in a black car and left, because he already knew he had time. He knew exactly how much time he had. I didn't. That's the difference. I drove Nate home that night. We got milkshakes. He talked the whole way about his roommate assignment, and I nodded and made noises. And I didn't hear a word of it, because that card was in my shirt pocket, and I could feel it against my chest like a hot coin. And I didn't tell him. That's my first mistake. I'm not going to dress it up. I had a chance to sit that kid down at my own kitchen table and say, something happened tonight and you deserve to know it from me, and I didn't take it. I told myself I was protecting him, told myself I'd wait till after the party at Gus's, then after his birthday, then after. The truth? I was scared, plain scared. 51 years old and scared like a kid hiding a bad report card. That night, after he went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and I typed that name in. Ashford Development Group, 40 years old. Started by a man named Thomas Ashford, built half the strip malls between Columbus and Dayton in the 80s. 200-something employees. And there was Miles, Chief Executive Officer. Photo on the leadership page in a gray suit against a gray wall. Somewhere out there, there'd been a whole other life going on. A life with parking garages and quarterly reports and a man in a gray suit, and all that time I'd been under a house in Wexford, Ohio, with a flashlight in my teeth, raising his kid. 9 days later, Nate walked into my shop on a Tuesday afternoon. He didn't hand me a wrench. He stood there in the doorway with the light behind him, and he said, "Dad, a guy came and talked to me at work." Nate was pushing carts at the Kroger that summer. $8.50 an hour. I set my tools down. I already knew. Miles Ashford, I said. And I watched my son's face change. It changed the way water changes when a cloud goes over it. Just dimmer. You knew? He talked to me at graduation. That was 3 weeks ago. I know. You knew and you didn't. He stopped himself. He's a good kid. He didn't yell. He never yelled at me, not once in 18 years, and honestly I wish to God he had, because what he did instead was go quiet and polite. He said, "Okay, Dad," and he left. Look, if you're anywhere in the story with me right now, do me a small favor. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and tap the bell so the next one finds you. It genuinely helps. Alright, let me tell you what July looked like. July looked like a black car in my driveway every Friday at 5. They did the DNA test the second week. Nate told me about it in the driveway, one hand on the door handle, already halfway gone. Cheek swab, mail in, 9 days. He said it like it was a formality. Because it was. Anybody with eyes knew. And then it came back, and everything I'd built started coming apart so smooth and so quiet you could barely hear it. I want to tell you how he did it. Because this is the part people get wrong about men like Miles Ashford. You think he showed up and trashed me, called me a hick? Made fun of the shop. He did the exact opposite. He was wonderful about me. Nate would come home from those dinners and he'd say, "He asked all about you. He said what you did was the most honorable thing a man can do. He said he owes you a debt he can't ever repay." He praised me, constantly. Warmly. In front of Nate every single chance he got. You know why? Because you can't defend yourself against praise. There's no move. A man insults me, my kid gets his back up on my behalf. But a man thanks me. A man calls me a saint, a hero, the guy who stepped in and did the dirty work. And slowly, without anybody ever saying the words out loud, I become a very nice man who did a favor. Not a father. A favor. He put me in a frame and hung me on the wall. Meanwhile, there was a watch. Then there was a car, a 2-year-old Audi, silver, just something safe for the highway. There was a weekend in Chicago. There was a suit fitted by an actual person with an actual tape measure, and my son standing in my living room in it, looking like a stranger from a magazine, asking me if it looked okay. And I said it looked great, because it did. But here's the thing that started keeping me up at night, and I want you to catch it, because I almost didn't. Miles knew things. He mentioned Nate's glasses, that we caught it because he sat too close to the TV. Nate never told him that, I asked. He knew Julia's middle name was Rose. He made a joke, offhand, about T-ball, about Nate hitting a dribbler up the first base line. I was there. I was the only other person on this earth who was there. And one Friday, I walked out to that black car to hand Nate his phone charger, and Miles rolled the window down and smiled at me and said, "That sign of yours out on Route 9, Dolan and Son. He painted that himself, didn't he? What was he, 12? 12? I stood in my own driveway with a phone charger in my hand, and I could not breathe. Because that man had never set foot in Wexford, Ohio in his life. And he knew my son was 12 when he painted that sign. He hadn't just found Nate, he'd been watching him. For years. Maybe the whole time. And on the 1st of August, Nate came into the kitchen and told me he was deferring Ohio State, 1 year. Just a gap year, Dad. An internship at Ashford. Learn the business. Miles had an apartment in Columbus with an extra bedroom. I said no. First time in 3 years, I'd told that kid no about anything, and I said it too loud and too fast, and he asked me why, and I couldn't tell him. Because what did I have? A feeling. A guy who knew about a sign, so I said the worst possible thing. I said, because I raised you and he didn't, and Nate looked at me, and his voice cracked, and he said, "Then why isn't your name on anything?" He'd looked. That's what that meant. He'd gone and looked at his own birth certificate. He was gone the next morning before I got up. 4 days of silence. 4 days of me calling Dale Whitcomb's office and leaving messages. 4 days of not eating. 4 days of Gus telling me to give the kid room. And on the 5th day, I came home from a service call at 6 in the evening, hot and filthy, and turned onto my street. And there was a black car sitting in my driveway, engine running, Miles Ashford behind the wheel looking straight ahead. And my son was standing on my porch with a cardboard box, waiting to tell me something. He didn't put the box down. That's what I noticed first. He had it up against his chest like a shield, this beat-up Kroger banana box with his gym stuff and his charger cord sticking out the top, and he wouldn't set it down on the step. Because setting it down would have meant staying a minute. I came up the walk still smelling like flux and burnt dust. I said, "Nate," and he said, "I'm getting the rest of my stuff." "Okay," I said, "it's your house." And he shook his head, small, once, like he was correcting a stranger. "It's your house," he said. He was standing on the porch we built. The one we poured in July of his 14th year, when it was 96 degrees and he screeded that concrete for 6 hours, and I let him press his handprint in the corner by the rail before it set. That handprint's still there. It was about 18 inches from his shoe. And he wouldn't look at me. 18 years, and that boy always looked me in the eye, even the time he put my truck in the ditch, even the day we buried his mother. And now he's staring at my mailbox like it's the most interesting thing in Ohio. "You're not my father," he said. "You never were." I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. And then he said it. "How much did they pay you to keep me?" Now, I've had a pipe wrench slip and catch me across the face. I've been shocked hard enough to sit down on a basement floor and forget my own name for a second. That's what that felt like. That exact thing. A white flash, and then nothing. "What? $600 a month," he said. "Since 2009, 16 years. His voice went up at the end and cracked, and he hated that it cracked. I could see it. "People's fidelity. First of the month, every month." He showed me the statements, Dad. He said Dad. He didn't even hear himself do it. But I heard it. "I never took $1 from anybody," I said. "They were sent. Not to me." "Then who?" And I didn't have an answer. That's the thing. I stood in my own yard, and I did not have one word to give him, because I didn't know what he was talking about, and I don't know. Sounds exactly like lying when a man's already decided you're a liar. He kept going, and I let him. I stood there, and I let that boy empty the whole clip. He said he never fought for me because Mom asked him not to. He said he respected that. He said he sent money every month for 16 years, and never asked for anything. Not a picture, not a phone call, nothing. And his eyes came up finally, and they were red and green and furious, and I swear to God they were that man's eyes. And he said, "You never adopted me because the day you did, the checks stop." There it is. That's the whole thing right there. That's the poison. It took him one sentence. Because how do you fight that? How does a man stand in a driveway and prove a thing he didn't do for 9 years? I couldn't say your mother wouldn't let me. What kind of coward hides behind a dead woman? And even if I'd said it, he'd have heard exactly what Miles Ashford wanted him to hear. Blame the woman in the ground. She can't argue. So I said the only true thing I had. I said, "Nate, look at the sign." And he said, "What? On Route 9, look at the sign. You painted it." "You were 12? 4 coats, you got green on my dog?" And for about a second and a half, I saw him. I saw my kid come back up behind his own face like somebody surfacing. And then the car horn went. One tap, polite, almost gentle, and he went. He carried that box down my walk and got in the passenger side of that black car, and he never turned around. And Miles Ashford, I'll give him this. Miles Ashford didn't look at me either. Didn't gloat, didn't need to. He backed out of my driveway, smooth as a man leaving church. And I stood in the yard until it got dark. You want to know what the worst part is? It's not the porch. It's that the house was still warm inside. His cereal bowl was still in the sink. He'd left the light on over the stove like he always did, like he was coming back, and he wasn't. I sat down at that kitchen table and I said out loud to nobody in an empty house, "Julia, what did you do? Hey, quick breath here. If this story's got its hooks in you, take 1 second and subscribe, hit that like, and turn the bell on so the next one comes and finds you. That's it." Now let me tell you what I did next, because I did it all wrong. I called Dale Whitcomb the next morning. Dale's 70-something, office above the hardware store, been doing wills and closings in that town since before I had a driver's license. I sat in his little brown office with the window unit rattling, and I told him everything. And Dale listened, and then he took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes, which is never a good sign from a lawyer. He said, "Ray." "How old is he?" 18. "Then there's nothing." I said there's gotta be something. 16 years. There's gotta be. And Dale said, real quiet, "Ray, if he was 7, you'd have a fight. Custody, standing, best interest, all of it. He's 18. He's a man. A man can walk out of any house he wants, and there's not one judge in this state, or any state, who'll stop him." He put his glasses back on. "You don't have a legal problem. You've got a broken heart. And I can't file a motion for that. So I went home, and I did the only thing I know how to do when something's broken. I opened it up. I got 16 years of bank statements. 16 boxes in the crawl space. a shoebox in the closet. And when that ran out, I sat at that table and pulled the rest off the bank's website, and I printed all of it at the library because my printer's been dead since 2019. 2,000 pages. Maybe more. And I went line by line, month by month, with a highlighter, at that kitchen table, every night after work, from July into the middle of August. Gus came by twice and told me I looked like hell. He was right. I was looking for $600. Because here's what I knew, sitting there, either that money came into my house, or it didn't. And if it didn't, then the man's a liar, and I can prove it, and I can put a piece of paper in my son's hand. You know what I found? Nothing. Not one deposit. Not one. 16 years of my life on paper, the second mortgage, the truck I sold, the 11 months Gus ran the shop for gas money, the oncology co-pays that ate us alive in 2021 and 2022. And I want to tell you something, because you need to understand what kind of woman Julia Dolan was. There were months in 2022 where we were $200 from the edge. $200. I remember a Tuesday, I put $12 of gas in my truck because that's what was in my wallet, and she was in the passenger seat with a knit cap on because her hair was gone, and she said, "It'll turn around, Ray." If there was $600 a month sitting somewhere in that woman's reach, she would not have let me sell that truck. She would not have let me watch her count out pills to make them last. So either Miles Ashford was lying to my son, or that money went somewhere I couldn't see, and I was about ready to quit. 2 a.m, middle of August, eyes burning, and I'm going through the joint checking one last time, and I'm not even reading anymore, I'm just dragging the highlighter down the column. And I stopped. March. $28. People's Fidelity, safety rental, annual. I sat up. I flipped back a year. March, $28. Flip back again. There it was. And again, and again, and again. Every March. 11 straight years going back to 2015. $28 a year coming out of an account with my own name on it that I signed the checks for, that I balanced at that same table, and I had never in my life noticed it. Because who notices $28? 3 of those years, my wife had been dead. Julia Dolan had a safe deposit box, and I'd been paying the rent on it every single spring for 11 years, and she never told me it existed. He never told me it existed. 11 years. I sat there in the dark with a highlighter in my hand and my heart going like a hammer, and I did what any man does at 2 a.m. with no sense left. I got in my truck. People's Fidelity, Dunmore Branch. 40 minutes on Route 9, past the grain elevator, past my own sign with the headlights sweeping over it. I got there at 3 a.m. and sat in an empty parking lot staring at a dark building like an idiot, because banks are not open at 3 a.m, and because there was nowhere else in this world I wanted to be. Dunmore. You know why that hit me? That's where we got married. That little courthouse is 4 blocks from that bank. She drove past that vault every time we went to the county fair. I was back at 8:58 when they unlocked the door. The woman at the desk was maybe 30, real kind, and she typed the name in, and I watched her face do that thing where a person gets careful with you. Box 1147, she said. Rented March of 2015. Julia R. Dolan, I said. That's my wife. Is she with you today, sir? She died in 2022, and she got quieter and kinder, and she told me the 2 things I did not want to hear. Number 1, my name was not on the signature card, not on it. 16 years of joint everything, house, checking, savings, the loan on the compressor, and she'd walked into that branch alone in the spring of 2015 and put one name on that card, hers. And number 2, even with a death certificate, even as her husband, I couldn't touch it. Not without court paper, and not without a key. I didn't have the paper, and I sure as hell didn't have a key. I drove to Dale Whitcomb's office, and I climbed those stairs over the hardware store, and I put it in front of him, and Dale looked at that bank statement for a long time. Longer than he needed to. He said, I can get you in. You're the surviving spouse. You're the executor. We reopen the estate. I file for letters. Judge Farris signs it. Week, maybe 10 days. 10 days. Then he said, Ray, sit down a minute, and here's how I knew something was wrong. In 20-some years, Dale Whitcomb has never once asked me to sit down. In the spring of 2015, he said, a woman came to see me, alone. On a weekday, she paid me $200 in cash out of an envelope. I said, Dale. She made me promise, he said, and I kept it. Because that's the job. I stood up so fast my chair went over. 10 years. 10 years that man watched me at the Legion fish fry, at Nate's ball games, at my wife's funeral. He was a pallbearer. Dale Whitcomb carried my wife's casket, and he knew there was a box. What's in it? I said. And Dale said, I don't know, I never saw it. She told me what she was afraid of, and she asked me one legal question, and she left. He took his glasses off. Ray, sit down, please. I didn't sit down. I said, what question? He said, she asked me whether a legal adoption would cut a child off from inheriting from his biological family. The room got very quiet. And what'd you tell her? I told her the truth, Dale said. In Ohio, and pretty much everywhere else, yes. A final adoption decree severs it, clean. The day you'd have signed those papers, Ray, in the eyes of the law, that boy would have stopped being in Ashford forever. I want you to sit with that, the way I had to sit with it in that brown little office with the window unit rattling. 9 years I brought papers home, 9 years she said not yet, and I'd spent all of them believing she was scared of a man coming back. She wasn't hiding from something, she was holding on to something. And I had no earthly idea what. 2 days later I got a certified letter. You know the kind. You have to sign for it, and the mail carrier won't look at you. Kessler and Bream, attorneys at law, Columbus. On behalf of their client, Mr. Miles Ashford, cease all contact with Nathan. Cease all unwelcome communication. Any further attempt to interfere with the relationship between Mr. Ashford and his son would be met with the full, and I'm quoting, full and vigorous resources of the firm. And then paragraph 6. Paragraph 6 said their client wished to acknowledge my years of service to the family and, in a spirit of goodwill, was prepared to offer me $75,000 in exchange for a signed mutual release, a non-disparagement agreement, and a confidentiality clause. $75,000. I sat on my tailgate in my own driveway and I read paragraph 6 about 9 times. Because, look, I'm not a smart man in the way that man is smart. But I've been under 3,000 houses in this county, and I'll tell you what I know. When a furnace runs fine for a week and then quits every time the wind comes out of the northwest, the problem isn't the furnace. The problem is something you can't see, and it's somewhere upstream, and it is nervous. Miles Ashford already had everything. He had the DNA test, he had the kid, he had the apartment, the car, the suit, the story. I was a 51-year-old Heaton airman in a town he'd never heard of, and I had nothing. No standing. Dale said so himself. I couldn't touch him. So why in God's name would a man like that pay me $75,000? You don't pay a man to be quiet unless he knows something. Trouble was, I didn't know what I knew. Gus came by that night with a 12-pack and didn't drink any of it, which is how I know he'd been talking to my sister-in-law. He sat in my kitchen and looked at the 2,000 pages spread over my table, and he said, Ray, when's the last time you ate a hot meal? I said something, I don't remember, and Gus said, you've torn this house apart. Where'd she keep the important stuff? And I laughed at him. Honest to God, I laughed. Because Julia Dolan didn't have important stuff, she had a shoebox of Christmas cards. She had a coffee can of buttons. She had a jewelry box with a broken clasp and $40 of costume junk in it. This woman went to her grave owning nothing, because she gave it all to us. I'd already been through every inch of it. Crawl space, attic, her closet, the shop, the toolbox, the deep freeze, the flour canister. I pulled the vent covers off the walls with a screwdriver at 11 o'clock at night, and if you think that's crazy, you've never had somebody take your kid. Nothing. 10 days of nothing. And on the 10th night, I gave up. That's the truth, and I'm not proud of it. I sat down on the edge of my bed at midnight, and I was done. Beat. And I did what I do most nights, which is reach over and pick up the picture on my nightstand. Courthouse steps. Done more. Her in that blue dress, hair blowing sideways, laughing at Gus because he'd said something stupid, and me looking at her like a man who'd just been handed the world. 4x6 photograph. Cheap wood frame from the drugstore. $14.99. And here's the thing that saved my son's life. I have carried a 100-pound compressor up a basement stair by myself. I have hauled cast iron radiators out of a 100-year-old farmhouse. I spent 30 years picking things up, and a man like me, you don't measure weight, you know it. It's in your hands. It's the one thing I've got. I picked up that picture the way I'd picked it up 1,000 nights in a row, and it was wrong. Heavier. Ounces. Barely anything. The kind of wrong you'd never notice unless you'd held it every single night for 11 years. I sat there with it in both hands and my whole body went cold. And I turned it over. Somebody had gone at the backing with a razor blade, you could see it in the cardboard, and taped it shut again with the good gray duct tape off my own shelf in the garage. I got my pocket knife. And taped flat against the back of my wedding picture. The picture that had been sitting 18 inches from my head every night while I slept, while I grieved, while I lost him. There was a small brass key with a number stamped in it. And underneath it, on the back of the photograph, in my wife's handwriting, that crooked left-handed scrawl I'd know anywhere, shaky, pressed hard, written by a woman who did not have much time left, Ray, If you're reading this, they came back. I'm so sorry. I lied to you 6 times. Take Dale. Don't go alone. I lied to you 6 times. Not once. Not, I kept something from you. 6. She'd counted them. My wife lay in that bed dying next to me, and she counted her lies like a woman balancing a checkbook, and she wrote the number down so I'd know exactly how much I'd been carrying. I sat on the edge of that bed till the sky went gray with that key in my fist and a photograph in my lap. And here's what I keep trying to explain to people who weren't there. I wasn't angry. Everybody expects me to say I was angry. I wasn't. I was relieved. Because, for the first time in 6 weeks, somebody was on my side. She was 3 years in the ground, and she was still trying to protect me from something, and she'd been trying so hard she'd hidden it 18 inches from my head and let me sleep next to it. Don't go alone. You don't write that unless you're afraid of what's inside. Dell filed on a Monday. Judge Ferris signed on a Thursday. 9 days, just like he said. We drove to Dunmore together on a Friday morning in the last week of August, Dale in the passenger seat of my truck with a folder on his knees and his seatbelt on, which he made a point of telling me about twice. They put us in a little room. Metal table. 1 chair. That smell banks have? Carpet glue and copier toner and money. The woman brought box 117 in and set it down and left us alone and closed the door, and Dale said, "Take your time, Ray." I didn't take my time. It wasn't full. That's what got me. All that, and there was maybe 2 inches of stuff in the bottom of a long gray metal box. On top, a birth certificate. Certified copy, Nathan James Dolan, and there it was, the line I'd been staring at in my head for 18 years. Fatter, blank. She'd left a blank on purpose. Underneath that, a hospital wristband, tiny, the kind they put on a baby's ankle, brittle and yellowed, and a little curl of hair in a plastic sleeve. Then a photograph I'd never seen. Julia, at 21, hugely pregnant, standing in front of a building I didn't recognize, squinting into the sun. Nobody with her, nobody ever with her. And underneath all of it, a brown accordion folder tied with a string. I untied the string. Number 1, a letter dated May of 2007. Kessler and Bream, attorneys at law, Columbus. Same letterhead as the one I'd signed for 2 weeks earlier. Same firm. Nearly 20 years apart, the same firm, and I felt the hair stand up on my arms. It was addressed to Julia Reyes, her name before me. It informed her that their client, Mr. Miles Ashford, disputed paternity, declined any voluntary acknowledgement, and would vigorously contest any action she might bring. It advised her that their client's family had significant resources and that litigation would be protracted and costly. It suggested she consider her circumstances carefully. She was 21 years old, 6 months pregnant, working at a diner. Number 2, an agreement, 6 pages, June of 2007. In exchange for $80,000, paid out at $400 and, later, $600 a month over 16 years, into a trust account administered by Kessler and Bream. Julia Reyes agreed to make no claim of paternity, to initiate no proceeding, to seek no support, and to make no disclosure of the agreement or of Mr. Ashford's identity to any person, including the child, until the child reached the age of majority. Dale read it over my shoulder, and I heard him breathe out through his teeth. There was the $600 a month. It never came to my house. It never came to her hand. It went into a lawyer's trust account in Columbus, and it sat there for 16 years because Julia Dolan never touched a dime of it, never signed a disbursement request, not when I sold my truck, not when we took the second mortgage, not one single time. She'd sold her silence, and then she'd refused to spend the money. And Miles Ashford, who never opened a bank statement in his life, who had people for that. Miles Ashford took 16 years of ledger entries in a trust account and showed my boy the total and let him believe it landed in my pocket. He didn't even lie, technically. That's what makes a man like that dangerous. He just handed my son a true document and let him draw the wrong picture. Number 3, a letter. Handwritten. Julia to Nate. Sealed, and across the front, in that same crooked scrawl for Nathan, on his 18th birthday, or if I'm not here. I set that one down on the table like it was made of glass. That wasn't mine. I have never in my life wanted to open something so badly, and I have never in my life been so sure I had no right to. And number 4. Number 4 was 2 sheets of paper, stapled, printed off a computer, and I want you to understand that I read the first page twice and it meant absolutely nothing to me. It was a copy of a legal notice out of a Columbus paper, dated February of 2008, an obituary. Thomas W. Ashford. Founder, Ashford Development Group, and a probate notice underneath it. Miles's father, Nate's grandfather, died in February 2008, the same month I crawled into a freezing basement on Vine Street and found her. I looked at Dale and said, "What am I looking at?" And Dale Whitcomb, 73 years old, hand spotted, glasses down his nose, read that second page and went absolutely still. He read it again. And then he took his glasses off, and he said something I'll hear till the day I die. He said, "Oh, that son of a bitch." The second page was 3 paragraphs photocopied out of a will. Article 9, Thomas Ashford's testamentary trust. Now, Dale had to walk me through it in that little room, twice, slow, and I'm going to give it to you the way he gave it to me, because it's the whole thing. It's everything. Old man Ashford was old money and old rules. He didn't trust his son. Never had, apparently. So when he set up the family trust, he did what those men do. He skipped a generation. The bulk of it, the real money, the land, the holdings, didn't go to Miles. Miles got income, a distribution, a nice, comfortable, controlled allowance for life. The corpus went into trust for the grandchildren. Per stirpus, split by branch of the family. And here's where Dale's finger stopped on the page and started shaking a little. Article 9 defined it. A beneficiary meant a lawful descendant of Thomas Ashford, by blood or by legal adoption. Dale said the old man put that in for his daughter, who'd adopted a little girl from overseas, and he wanted her covered, and it was a kind thing to do, and it was the exact thing that opened the door. Or by legal adoption. And there was a paragraph about closing the class. Dale explained it 3 times, and I'll say it the simple way. The pot got divided when the last surviving grandchild turned 25. Fixed. Locked. Whoever's in the class on that date, that's who splits it. And Miles's other kids. He had 2 daughters with a wife in Columbus. The younger one, Dale figured from the dates, was coming up on 25 inside of 2 years. I said, "Dale, I'm a furnace guy. Say it plain." And Dale Whitcomb looked at me across that metal table in that little room and said it plain. He said, "Ray, if Nathan is legally that man's son, he takes a share of his grandfather's trust, and Miles's own daughters take less. Every dollar that boy gets comes straight out of theirs." And I still didn't get it. I swear I didn't. I said, "Then why would Miles come find him? Why would he want him? Doesn't that cost his own kids money?" And Dale said, "Yes." And then he turned the page over and pointed at the last paragraph, and I watched a 73-year-old man's jaw go tight. "Unless," he said, "Miles is the trustee." "Trustee," I said. "That's just what? The guy who runs it. That's the guy who holds it," Dale said. "Ray, listen to me. The trustee doesn't own a nickel of that money. He administers it. He signs the checks, he manages the property, he decides when a beneficiary is ready, he sets his own reasonable fee. He is the gate. And under Article 9, the trustee's job ends the day the class closes and the money goes out the door. He tapped the page, but every beneficiary who's still a minor or still under a distribution age keeps that gate open, keeps the trustee in the chair, keeps the fee running. And I sat there in that little metal room, and I felt something turn over in my chest, slow, like a motor catching. "Nate's 18, I said. "Nate's 18, Dale said. "The girls are 23 and 24. 2 years and Miles Ashford is done. He's out. Fee stops, control stops, and 40 years of his father's holdings walk out that door into his daughter's hands, and Miles Ashford goes back to being a man on an allowance." Dale sat back. "But you drop an 18-year-old into that class. He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. 7 more years. 7 more years of holding the whole thing. 7 more years of fees, of signing, of being Ashford Development Group instead of just working there. And I heard that man's soft, uncalloused voice in my driveway. He's got my mother's eyes. He hadn't come back for a son. He'd come back for 7 years. My boy wasn't a child to that man. He was a clock. I put my hands flat on that table, and I looked at the ceiling and I laughed. It wasn't a good laugh. Dale put his hand on my arm. "Because you see it now, don't you? You see the whole ugly shape of it. In 2007, that man spent $80,000 to make sure Nate never existed. Because his father was still alive, and old Thomas Ashford was a hard man with rules, and a bastard grandchild by a diner waitress was a scandal that could have cost Miles his place at the table. And then 8 months later, the old man died, and the will got read. And Miles Ashford found out that the son he'd paid to erase was the one thing on this earth that could keep him in the chair. So he waited. That's the part that turns my stomach. He waited 18 years. He let that boy grow up on frozen pizza and hand-me-down cleats. He let his mother die at 38 counting pills. He watched. Dale figured it out later, a private investigator on retainer, quarterly reports. That's how he knew about the glasses and the T-ball and the sign. He paid a man to watch my son grow up like a crop. And he came in the summer, the boy turned 18, right on schedule, right when Nate could sign his own name and nobody could stop him. He didn't want a son, he wanted a signature. And me, I wasn't a rival, I was the risk. Because every single year that I brought those adoption papers home to my kitchen table, and Julia looked at them and said, "Not yet," I was one signature away from severing that boy from the Ashford line forever and locking Miles Ashford out of his own inheritance clock. She wasn't protecting Nate's money. That's what I thought at first, and it's wrong. She was protecting Nate's leverage. That woman sat in a diner at 21 and got beat by a man with a law firm, and she never forgot it. And when she figured out what that will said, and I'll never know how, maybe it was public record, maybe she just read the paper, she realized she'd been handed the only card she'd ever hold, so she held it, quiet, for 16 years. She lied to me 6 times to hold it. And here's the part that makes me want to put my head down. Sitting in that vault, I finally understood the last conversation I ever had with her, 2 weeks before she died. She was mostly out of it by then, but she came out for a minute, and she grabbed my wrist with what was left of her hand, and she said, "Ray, when he's 18, don't sign anything." And I thought she meant the hospital paperwork. I thought she was confused. She wasn't confused. She was down to her last breath, and she was still standing in that diner, still fighting that man. Listen, take a second here with me. If this is hitting you the way it hit me, do me a kindness, subscribe, drop a like, and turn that bell on so you don't miss what happens next. Because now I have to tell you how I got my son back, and it isn't how you think. I didn't go to Columbus. Everything in me wanted to. I wanted to drive that truck downtown and find that man in a lobby with marble floors and put him through a window. And that's exactly what he wanted. Think about it. One shove, one raised voice, and I'm a violent, unstable, jealous man from a small town who couldn't handle losing, and every single thing I ever said about him after that is just noise from a bitter guy. He'd have had it on video in an hour. Paragraph 6 was the invitation. $75,000 was him hoping I'd do something stupid. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Nothing. For 9 days, I did nothing. I went to work. I fixed a heat pump on Mercer Street. I ate. I slept some, and Dale and I built it. Because here's what Dale said to me in that truck on the way home, and it changed everything. "Ray, you can't win this. You've got no standing, no claim, no case. You are not a party to anything." Then he looked over at me. "But Nathan is." Nathan's a beneficiary of a trust he's never been told about, and the man asking him to sign things is the trustee. "Ray, that's not a family problem. That's a fiduciary problem." Miles Ashford wasn't just Nate's father. He was the man legally obligated to protect Nate's interest in that money, while personally profiting off Nate's ignorance of it. Dale made 3 calls. First one was to a woman named Renee Okafor down in Columbus, who does nothing but trust and estate litigation, and apparently owed Dale something from 1994. Second was to the probate court to pull the Thomas Ashford file, which, and this is the thing Miles never counted on, because men like him think money makes a thing private, was public record. Anybody could walk in and read it. Anybody. For 18 years, the whole answer sat in a courthouse in Columbus, and nobody looked, because nobody knew to look. And the third call was to a private investigator to find out exactly who'd been sending in those quarterly reports about my son's eyeglasses. We put it together on my kitchen table, on top of 2,000 pages of my own bank statements. The 2007 letter, where he swore under his lawyer's letterhead the boy wasn't his. The 2008 will, where the boy became worth 7 years to him. The 2025 DNA test, where he suddenly, warmly, publicly claimed him. Same firm, Kessler and Bream, both letters, 18 years apart. Renee Okafor read all of it and called me at 10 o'clock at night, and I remember she was quiet for a second, and then she said, Mr. Dolan, I've been doing this 26 years. This is the cleanest breach of fiduciary duty I have ever seen on paper. And I said, can you take him down? And she said, that's not the right question. She said, the question is whether that young man wants us to. Because that was the wall. That was the whole wall. I couldn't file, Dale couldn't file, Renee couldn't file, only Nate could. And Nate wouldn't take my calls. 17 calls, not one answer. Texts he never opened. He blocked my number by the second week, and I only found out because a message to him bounced off Gus's phone. My son thought I was a man who'd been paid $600 a month to keep him, And the one person on this earth who could stop Miles Ashford was the person Miles Ashford had already turned against me. So there was exactly one thing left in that box that I hadn't used, and it wasn't mine. For Nathan, on his 18th birthday, or if I'm not here, I sat in my kitchen on a Tuesday night in September with that sealed letter in front of me, and I understood something. If I drove it to Columbus, he'd never open it. He'd think I forged it. He'd think it was the last, most desperate lie from a man who'd been lying for 18 years. Coming from my hand, it was worthless. It was worse than worthless. It had to come from somewhere he couldn't argue with. And that's when I remembered the second thing in that box. The thing I hadn't thought about once. The photograph. Julia at 21, pregnant, squinting into the sun, standing in front of a building. I'd never seen that building in my life, but I'd seen that awning. I'd seen that exact green awning in a 1,000-year-old photo on a wall, because I'd eaten at that counter twice a week for 2 years while she worked the late shift. Somebody took that picture. Somebody was there, in 2007, on the day a scared pregnant girl stood in the sun outside the diner where she worked. Somebody who knew her before I did. And I knew exactly who. And so did Nate, because she'd been at every birthday party that boy ever had. I picked up the phone and I called Julia's sister, Dana Reyes, 2 years older than Julia, a nurse in Fort Wayne, and the only human being alive who'd known my wife before I did. She picked up on the second ring and I said, "Dana, I need to ask you about a photograph." And she said, "Ray, I've been waiting 3 years for you to call me." She'd taken it. September of 2007, standing in the gravel lot outside the Blue Star Diner on Miller Road because her little sister was 6 months pregnant and alone, and Dana had made her stand in the sun and smile so there'd be one picture of it. One. Just one, so the kid could someday see that somebody wanted him from the start. Then she said, "Did you find the box?" I had to sit down on my own kitchen floor. She didn't know what was in it. Julia never told her that. But she knew there was one, and she knew Julia had gone to Dunmore alone in 2015, and she knew, because she'd argued with her sister about it for years, that Julia had made her swear on their mother that she'd never say a word about a man named Ashford unless one thing happened. Unless he came back. She said if he ever came back, Dana told me, it would be because he wanted something, not because he wanted Nate. I drove to Fort Wayne the next morning with that sealed letter on the passenger seat. I gave it to her at a Cracker Barrel off the interstate, and I said, "I need you to take this to him. Not me, you, and Dana. I need you to promise me you won't say one word about me while you do it, not one. Don't defend me, don't explain me." He won't hear it. And she said, "Ray, that's not fair to you." And I said, "I'm not trying to be right, I'm trying to get him free." She drove to Columbus that Saturday. I don't know exactly what happened in that apartment. I've never asked for the whole thing. Here's what I know. She got past the doorman because she's a 53-year-old nurse in a cardigan, and nobody stops a woman like that. And she handed my son an envelope in his mother's handwriting with his name on it, and she said, "Your mom left this for you. I'm not staying." And she left. Because you cannot argue with a dead woman's handwriting. There is no rebuttal. There is no counteroffer. Miles Ashford had a law firm and a black car and 18 years of patience, and none of it was worth a damn against 4 pages in a big pen, written by a woman who was dying and knew it. She never once mentioned the trust. Dana told me that later, after Nate showed her. Julia didn't understand the trust. I don't think she ever fully did. She just knew the shape of the man. The letter said, "I'm sorry I lied to you." It said, "Your father's name is Miles Ashford, and here's what he did in 2007, and here's the paper that proves it." It said, "If he ever comes for you, he's not coming for you." And it said one more thing. The last line. Nate showed me, eventually, on my porch in October. Nathan, the man who raised you, never asked me for one thing in 16 years. Not one. That's how you'll know which one is your father. He didn't call me that day. He didn't call me for 6 days. I want to be honest about that. Because I think there's a version of the story where the kid comes running home and everything's fine in an afternoon, and that's not what happened. He had 18 years to undo. He had a man he'd loved for 4 months to unmake in his own head. What he did instead was go through the whole thing himself. He pulled the probate file at the courthouse, walked in off the street like anybody could, like nobody ever had. He read Article 9. He's a smart kid, he read it 4 times, and it still took him a day and a half. He figured out the ages of his own half-sisters. He did the math on the class closing. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of September, my phone rang from a number I didn't know. And a voice I've known since it was a baby crying in a cold apartment said, "Dad." That's it. That's all he got out for about 30 seconds. Then he asked me to sign something. Miles had put a document in front of him 3 days after Nate moved to Columbus. A consent and acknowledgement. accepting Miles as fiduciary, waiving formal accounting, waiving the right to independent counsel, and consenting to a deferred distribution schedule to age 25. 7 years. Right there in a paragraph. Nate had almost signed it in August. He'd had the pen in his hand. He said the only reason he didn't was that it was on his birthday and Miles wanted a photograph of him signing it. And something about the photograph part made his skin crawl and he said he'd do it next week. He never signed it. That's my wife. Right there. That's her, reaching out of the ground. Renee Okafor filed in October. I'm going to keep this part short because, honestly, the law is boring right up until the moment it isn't. She didn't sue him for being a bad father. There's no cause of action for that. She filed a petition on behalf of Nathan Dolan, beneficiary, to remove the trustee for breach of fiduciary duty and to compel a full accounting. And she attached that 2007 letter to it like a knife. Because here's what Miles Ashford could never explain, not in a deposition, not to a judge, not to anybody. He had actual knowledge, in 2007, that a potential beneficiary of his father's trust existed. He concealed it from the trust for 18 years. He administered that trust and collected his fee on it the entire time. And the day the concealment became profitable to him, he suddenly produced the beneficiary and tried to get that beneficiary to waive his right to independent counsel, in writing, with a pen, on his birthday. Renee said the deposition lasted 4 hours. She said he was smooth for the first 3. She said the 4th hour was the best afternoon of her career. Judge signed the removal order in March. He's out. Permanently barred from serving as fiduciary on anything of his father's, ever. There's a surcharge action against him for the fees. Renee says 16 years of them, plus interest, and she'll get most of it. The court appointed an independent bank as trustee. Kessler and Brame withdrew from representing him in about a week. Turns out a firm doesn't love being on both sides of the same lie, 20 years apart, in a public filing. And his daughters. That's the karma nobody scripted. They found out, not from us. From the filing. It's public, same as their grandfather's will had been public the whole time. 2 grown women in Columbus read in a court document that their father had known about their brother since before either of them was born, had paid to bury him, then dug him back up to use as a stopwatch. They reached out to Nate, not to Miles, to Nate. They had Thanksgiving at my house. The older one brought a pie. I want you to picture that. 2 women in nice coats standing in my kitchen in Wexford, Ohio, meeting my son's baby pictures on the refrigerator. Miles Ashford didn't lose his money. Men like that don't. He still got the allowance his father left him, which, and I laughed about this for a week, is exactly what old Thomas Ashford decided his son was worth in the first place. The old man saw him coming from 40 years away. He just lost every single thing that made him feel like a man. The chair. The name on the door, his daughters, and the son he came back for. He got what he wanted, in a way. He's an Ashford with an allowance. Nate started at Ohio State last fall. He's 20 now, business major, which he finds funny for reasons I don't. He drives up on weekends when he can and hands me wrenches and doesn't say much for 2 hours, and it's still the best part of my day. And in November, the week after Thanksgiving, we drove out to Route 9 with a stepladder and 2 cans of paint, and we redid that sign. It had gotten pretty faded. Same letters. Same crooked D he could never get straight when he was 12. Dolan and Son. He wanted to change it. Wanted to add a name to it, make it official, and I told him no. It's already right. It's been right since he was 12 years old with green paint on my dog. We never did the adoption. Didn't need to. Renee says there's no legal reason left, and I say there's no reason at all. You don't sign a paper to make a thing true that's been true since a February night in 2008 when a baby stopped crying because the radiator started ticking. She lied to me 6 times. I'd let her lie to me 100, because that woman knew exactly what was coming, and she stood in front of it for 16 years, alone, with nothing but a diner job and a safe deposit box and a stubborn streak the size of Ohio. And she won. She's the only one who ever really did. If this story stayed with you, and you'd like to hear more true-to-life stories of buried secrets, quiet betrayals, and justice that finally comes home, tap the video on your screen right now. I'll be waiting for you there.